So, what did COVID really do to Britain's economy? Well, those years of COVID lockdowns were certainly not enjoyable, especially from a social standpoint. But that in itself is a completely different rabbit hole to jump down. Maybe in a later video, I'm not quite sure. But the TLDR answer is that it hurt our economy really badly. So, the surprising thing is that fewer people than you might think have actually delved into the stats. So, I decided to make this and save you the trouble of the research. And actually, in my research, I came across a useful stats sheet, which I'll link in the description, and that forms the basis of this video. So, if you hadn't already picked up on it, I'm talking about the economic impacts of COVID. This video is going to be split into three parts. So, firstly, the economic implications and developments that COVID had on the British economy, then the impacts on public spending, and finally, the general trends in public finances. In 2020, Britain's GDP dropped by 11%. GDP, or in full, gross domestic product, is the total monetary value of goods and services produced in a country in a given amount of time. And this is going to be looked at annually in most cases, apart from one later instance where I look at it in terms of months. But it's a massive drop, 11%. And that's the steepest annual drop since consistent records of GDP began in the UK in 1948. And that would mean that COVID actually had worse impacts on GDP than the 2008 financial crash. Estimates would put it at the largest drop in GDP since 1709. And since then, Britain has fought Napoleon, the USA, China, and two world wars. And there are plenty more wars which don't even match this drop in GDP. We could be even more precise with our time periods and say that after the lockdown in April of 2020, GDP was 26% lower than it had been just 2 months before in February. The further lockdowns in the autumn of 2020 and the winter of 2021 had negative effects on GDP, but these weren't as severe because people had become more acclimatized to the impacts of lockdowns. And when you see a sharp drop in GDP, you'd think that unemployment rates would fly through the roof. But these were actually a lot more benevolent, and that's mostly down to government support schemes like the furlough scheme. About 8 million workers were furloughed in April and May of 2020. The peak number was 8.9 million, which is about a third of UK workers on the 8th of May. The pandemic also had an impact on the interest rates in our country. So before the pandemic hit, this stood at about 0.75%, but the Bank of England cut that to 0.1%. As well as this, the Bank of England actually used quantitative easing to try to raise more money for the government. So it's essentially a way for the Bank of England to introduce additional money into the economy. By December 2021, this had been doubled from £445 billion to an £895 billion programme. Most of the money created here was actually spent on government bonds, so this was a way for the government to increase their funds. But this would really show the strain that COVID had on the government, because if they were raising about £900 billion to try and spend, it would show you how much more they were spending. So, speaking of public spending, let's move on to that. The International Monetary Fund estimated that the British government had spent approximately £407 billion by September of 2021. Other estimates place this value slightly lower, such as the Office for Budget Responsibility, which puts this at £311 billion by March of 2022, and the National Audit Office with £376 billion by June of 2022. For the purpose of detail, I've gone with the National Audit Office, since we've actually got a detailed breakdown here, which you can see, of where this spending went. So £147 billion went to support businesses, £89 billion was spent on health and social care, £75 billion spent on other public services and emergency responses, and £59 billion spent on support for individuals. The remaining budget was spent on operational costs here. Outside of this figure as well, we've actually got £850 million spent on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which was implemented by the government to try to stimulate economic activity for local businesses. So, what were the general implications of this spending? Well, the government's budget deficit reached a record high of 15% of GDP in 2020 to 21, as government spending increased and tax revenue fell. The last time the budget deficit exceeded 10% of GDP was during the 2008 financial crisis. And before that, you have to look back to the Second World War. Between 2020 and 2022, this fell back down to 5.7% of GDP, but this is still the 11th highest instance of this since the late 1940s. We could compare these figures to the OBR estimates for the budget deficit in 2020 to 21. So these are estimates that were made before the year of 2020 about how the UK economy would do. And estimates put a budget deficit at £55 billion, but this was actually going to turn out to be £312 billion for that year. Public spending was £179 billion higher than the forecast, and government revenue was £79 billion lower than forecast. These huge disparities show that COVID actually drove the economy into crisis mode. The spending also had a profound impact on government debt. Before the pandemic, this was about 80% of GDP, and that's not even in particularly good shape. But at the end of 2022, this had risen to 97% of GDP. So, in short, COVID cost an absolute ton of money and meant that the government couldn't actually raise the money they needed to spend. So they borrowed a whole lot more of it and printed even more. And it's going to take very many years for the scars to be healed in the British economy.